Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Max's late-night return had been as silent as the quiet hum of his car's engine, barely disturbing the empty house. It was well past 10, but no one was there to welcome him back, not even Camilla, who usually insisted on staying awake for his arrivals. As he stepped inside, he noticed the faint scent of perfume in the air, a trace that felt oddly out of place and too fresh for an empty home. His gaze sharpened as he took in the small, telling signs around him. A forgotten wine glass on the kitchen counter, lipstick smudges on its rim. Her belongings, hastily left out a handbag and scarf that normally wouldn't have been abandoned this carelessly. Despite the late hour, an uneasy feeling gnawed at him, stirring thoughts he had been reluctant to confront. Methodically, almost without thought, Max headed to their shared study where he kept his important documents. He opened a drawer and froze, staring at a thick, unassuming stack of receipts. Some were from familiar stores, places they'd been together. But buried among them were the ones that chilled him: hotel names and restaurant charges he'd never heard her mention. Room charges, meals for two. Each piece of paper felt heavier than the last, pulling him deeper into a pit of cold clarity. The evidence he had in his hands was damning, each receipt echoing her deception, her lies. And as he stood alone in the silence, Max knew these weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. It was the proof he had feared, but now that he held it, he was past denial. This would change everything. Max sat in the dimly lit study, the stack of receipts spread across the desk like a silent confession. Each slip of paper, every faded ink date and unfamiliar location, struck him like a hammer to the heart. One by one, he examined them, unable to stop himself from piecing together the quiet betrayal written on each line. There were hotel names he'd never visited, even on his business trips, and restaurant bills showing charges for 2 meals, paired drinks, sometimes 2 glasses of expensive wine. His fingers hovered over the paper, steady but cold, as he fought to process the implications. For months, he had been the trusting husband, waving away the whispers of doubt that now screamed in his mind. Camilla's sudden work meetings, her weekends out with vague excuses of catching up with old friends, had seemed harmless at first. But each excuse, each distant glance she cast when they were alone, now fit into a larger, darker pattern he couldn't ignore. He sat back in the chair, letting the silence settle around him, feeling the weight of it press against his chest. His own pulse thudded in his ears, a steady reminder of his fury held in check by a thin thread of restraint. He had never been a jealous man, had always thought of himself as rational, grounded. He prided himself on his trust in people, in her. But now, that trust lay in ruins, scattered among the receipts in front of him. He remembered the first time he'd noticed something was amiss. It was a simple evening, one of the rare nights they both were home early. Camilla had excused herself from the table to take a phone call. It was quick, too quick, and when she returned, there had been a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of worry, or maybe guilt. Max had seen it, but he dismissed it, telling himself he was reading too much into things. Now, that memory seemed almost laughable in its innocence. Leaning forward, he picked up one of the receipts from a high-end hotel just outside the city. He flipped it over, the date scrawled on the back, 2 months ago, during one of her late work nights. She had come home that evening smelling of something different, something sharp and foreign. He had asked her about her day, and she'd shrugged, vaguely mentioning a long meeting. He'd believed her then, as he always had, until this moment. The minutes stretched on, each one filled with the stinging awareness that his reality was crumbling. His love, his marriage, was built on nothing more than a convincing lie. But now, he would be the one with the upper hand. He would confront her not with rage, but with the cold, undeniable truth laid out in black and white. He imagined her face, the mask she would likely wear, the rehearsed excuses she'd scrambled to find, but he was past allowing her any room to maneuver. He collected each receipt, placing them neatly back in a folder, ensuring he had a clear, concise record of everything. Tonight he would wait, and when she returned, he would give her one chance to reveal the truth. One chance to confess without knowing that he already held all the evidence he needed to end this betrayal, and possibly their life together. Max paced the silent living room, his eyes flicking from the clock on the wall to the door. Midnight had come and gone, and still, Camilla was nowhere in sight. The waiting felt endless, each second drawing out the tension inside him, coiling it tighter. He'd rehearsed his confrontation in his mind, carefully crafting his words to pierce through whatever lies she might throw his way. But in the dead quiet of the house, a part of him still hoped she would walk through the door with an innocent explanation. Maybe the receipts were a misunderstanding, an elaborate mix-up. But his gut, hollow and raw, told him otherwise. The sound of a car in the driveway finally broke the silence. Max's heart beat faster, but his face remained still, expression unreadable. He waited as her key turned in the lock as she quietly stepped inside, startled to see him there, standing in the shadows. "Max?" she asked, her voice soft but guarded, surprised to find him awake. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep," he replied evenly, his eyes never leaving her. "How was the meeting?" She blinked, pausing for a beat too long. It ran late. You know how these things go." She offered a slight smile, the kind she usually used to charm her way out of his questions. But tonight, it only fueled the anger simmering inside him. "I see," he said, nodding slowly. "It must have been some meeting, Camilla. Hotels, dinners, quite a bit to catch up on." The color drained from her face, her eyes widening for a split second before she masked it with a look of forced calm. "What are you talking about, Max?" "Don't," he cut her off, his voice low but hard. He crossed the room in measured steps, feeling her retreat with every inch he gained. "I found the receipts. The hotel bills, the dinners for two, all the things I thought you were doing with me." Camilla's gaze faltered, her composure slipping as she tried to come up with something, anything, to bridge the silence stretching between them. "Max, I don't know what you think you found, but this is insane. Those are probably just work expenses." "Work expenses?" he echoed, voice sharp with disbelief. "Tell me, Camilla, do you typically order champagne with your colleagues after hours? Or book a suite with them for a few hours here and there?" She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time, her facade began to crack, a glimpse of vulnerability shining through as she looked away, grasping for words that wouldn't come. Her silence was enough. Max felt the final thread of his hope snap. "Bet you have anything to say for yourself?" he asked, his tone softening into something colder, resigned. "Anything to help me understand why you've been lying to my face for months?" "Max, her voice faltered, and he watched as she struggled to meet his gaze. Finally, she looked at him, a flash of guilt and something else, fear, perhaps flickering in her eyes. "It's complicated. I didn't mean for it to go this far." His jaw clenched. "You didn't mean for it to go this far. So how far were you planning to take it?" Silence hung between them, thick and heavy. There were no excuses left for her to reach for, no words that could smooth over the betrayal that lay between them. Max's eyes never left Camilla as she lowered her purse onto the table, her movements unsteady. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way she pressed her lips together as if to stop any words from slipping out. She was normally so composed, so sure of herself this side of her was almost unrecognizable. But then, so was the life they shared, now fractured beyond repair by everything he'd uncovered. "Complicated," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air between them. "That's all you have to say." His voice was calm, almost too calm. But the look in his eyes held an intensity that forced her to look away. Camilla swallowed, folding her arms protectively across her chest. "Max, please, just hear me out," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her usual confidence was slipping, her control unraveling. "I never wanted this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." Max's laugh was bitter, a sound devoid of humor. "Didn't want to hurt me. Camilla, do you know how many times I ignored my gut? How many nights I convinced myself you were just working late?" His voice softened, turning almost fragile. "I wanted to trust you, Camilla. I chose to trust you." Camilla flinched, her eyes filling with a mix of guilt and something else, shame. She took a tentative step toward him, but he held up his hand, a clear barrier she dared not cross. "Max, please," she started, her voice breaking slightly. "I know I've been distant, but it's just I don't know how to explain it." She paused, fumbling for words, and he could see the gears turning in her mind as she struggled to shape the truth into something palatable. "Things changed between us slowly over time. I felt, I don't know, trapped maybe, but I never stopped caring about you." He narrowed his eyes, his anger momentarily overshadowed by disbelief. "Trapped? You felt trapped?" He shook his head, a fresh wave of anger surging through him. "Camilla, this marriage was supposed to be a partnership. If you felt trapped, why didn't you just talk to me?" She looked down, her shoulders slumping as if under a weight she could no longer bear. "Because I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Afraid that you wouldn't understand. Afraid that I'd lose everything if I told you how I was feeling." Max's gaze hardened. "So instead, you just kept lying, sneaking around behind my back, hiding hotel bills and romantic dinners." He took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. Who is he? The question seemed to knock the air out of her. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as though grappling with whether she could bear to reveal the truth. Finally, she whispered, "It doesn't matter, Max. None of it matters. He doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't mean anything." Max's voice was sharp, cutting her off. "Camilla, if it didn't mean anything, why throw away everything we built together?" His tone softened, almost pleading, as he struggled to understand. How could you be with someone else and pretend, all this time, that nothing was wrong? That we were, that I was enough. Tears glistened in her eyes now, her guilt raw and exposed. She reached out, her hand hovering between them as if hoping he'd still reach back. But he stayed rooted in place, unmoved. The realization that this was all too real, too deep to undo was written plainly across her face. Max, I don't know what else to say. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I do love you. That's never changed. Max closed his eyes, her words washing over him with a finality that felt unbearable. When he opened them again, he spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, filled with resignation. Maybe it's not enough, Camilla. Maybe it's too late. With that, he turned, walking away to leave her alone with the weight of her betrayal. Max walked away, his footsteps echoing softly through the hallway, each step heavy with the weight of 1,000 realizations he could barely contain. He reached their bedroom and closed the door behind him, leaning against it as if needing support to stay upright. The air felt stifling, thick with the remnants of Camilla's perfume, that familiar, floral scent now tainted by all he knew. The place that once offered comfort and warmth now seemed suffocating, every corner of the room a reminder of a trust that was irreparably broken. He sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes drifting to their wedding photo on the nightstand. In the picture, they were young and beaming, her arms wrapped around him as if nothing could come between them. The memory hit him with an unexpected force, and he felt a sharp pang in his chest as he stared at the faces of two people who had once believed in forever. Had that all been a lie too? Or had she once loved him as fully as he had loved her? He picked up the photo, his fingers brushing over the glass, and then placed it face down on the nightstand. It was too painful to look at right now, that reminder of a happiness he might never feel again. He took a deep breath, fighting to keep his emotions under control, but the hollow ache in his chest only grew stronger. As he sat there, he heard a faint knock on the door. He stiffened, unwilling to face her yet again, but he knew she wasn't going to just leave him alone. After a long moment, the door opened slightly and Camilla stepped inside, her face pale and eyes rimmed with red. "Max," she said softly, her voice barely audible. She took a few cautious steps forward, like someone approaching a wounded animal. I didn't want it to end like this. I don't want to lose you." Max looked up, his expression unreadable, but there was a hardness in his gaze that stopped her in her tracks. "You didn't want it to end like this?" he repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Camilla, you were the one who decided to end this the moment you decided to lie to me, to go behind my back." She bit her lip, looking down at her hands. I know I messed up. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to make things right. I need you to understand that it was never about you. It was about me. I felt like I was losing myself." "Losing yourself?" Max's voice grew colder, more distant. "And you found yourself with another man? That's your idea of fixing things?" Camilla's shoulders slumped as if the words had physically hit her. "I know how it sounds. I know it was wrong. I've been so ashamed, so afraid to tell you the truth because I knew I was being selfish. But Max, I need you to understand that I do love you. I've always loved you." Max shook his head slowly, feeling the weight of her words, but they rang hollow, empty. "Love?" he asked, the word coming out like an accusation. "How can you say that when you've been hiding things from me for so long, lying every time you walked out the door?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at him, desperate. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of how much it would hurt you. Afraid of what you'd think of me if you knew the truth." Max stood up, crossing his arms over his chest. "Well, now I know," he said firmly, "and I have to live with it. And so do you." His voice dropped, sadness seeping into his words. "You broke everything that mattered to us, Camilla. Everything." She took a shaky breath, reaching out toward him. "Max, please. Give me a chance to make it up to you. I'll do anything. I'll cut off all contact with him. We can start over, rebuild." But he could only shake his head, his face weary, defeated. "You had a choice, Camilla. You chose to break our vows. You chose to put someone else in our life." He took a step back, his voice a whisper. "I don't think I can ever trust you again." The weight of his words fell over her, final and irreversible, and as she looked at him, she realized the truth of what she had lost. She could only stand there in silence, unable to close the distance between them as he turned away, leaving her alone with the consequences of her betrayal. The night dragged on as Max found himself pacing the quiet house, moving from room to room like a ghost unable to find rest. The intensity of the confrontation had drained him, yet he was far from calm. The quiet made every thought echo louder, filling his mind with the brutal replay of Camilla's words, her excuses, her pleas. They rattled around in his head, only fueling the sense of betrayal that gnawed at him with every step. He wandered into the kitchen, where the glass she'd left out earlier still stood on the counter. He remembered their last quiet evening together just 2 weeks before, when they'd shared a bottle of wine and laughed over dinner like nothing had changed. The memory now felt distant, unreal, like it belonged to a different couple in another life. His mind replayed that moment, and he felt the anger rise again, anger not just at her but at himself, for not seeing this coming sooner, for letting himself trust so completely. He poured himself a glass of water, but as he stared into it, his mind drifted back to the receipts he had found, each one a piece of the puzzle that had been right under his nose. All the little signs that he had brushed aside, the minor inconsistencies in her explanations, seemed obvious now. It was almost as if the betrayal had been hiding in plain sight, taunting him while he had looked the other way, believing in their love, their marriage. A quiet knock on the kitchen doorframe made him look up. Camilla stood there, watching him cautiously, her arms wrapped around herself, a look of deep regret etched into her face. She looked smaller somehow, as if she were shrinking under the weight of her own guilt. "Max," she began, her voice so soft he had to strain to hear it. I couldn't sleep." He said nothing, only regarded her with a cool, distant gaze, waiting to see what she would say. "I know I've hurt you," she continued, voice trembling, her vulnerability stark and raw. "I know you probably hate me right now, and maybe you'll never forgive me. But I want you to know that this isn't who I wanted to be." Max scoffed, his disbelief sharpening his voice. "Who you wanted to be? Camilla, you were lying to me for months, living 2 lives. Did you think about what this would do to us? To me?" She flinched, looking down. "No," she whispered. "I was selfish. I kept telling myself I could handle it, that it didn't mean anything, that I'd stop. But I don't know. I was lost, and I thought maybe I could keep it separate." "Separate?" Max's voice rose, his anger breaking through the calm. "You kept it separate by bringing it into our lives, Camilla, by letting this lie seep into everything we have. And you say it didn't mean anything. It meant enough for you to risk everything." She bit her lip, tears filling her eyes as she took a step closer. "Max, please, I know there's nothing I can say to make this right. I know that. But if you can find it in yourself to give me a chance, I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust I destroyed." Max looked at her, her face a mixture of regret and desperation. The sincerity in her eyes stirred something in him, a flicker of the love they once shared. But it was a love shadowed now by too many lies, too much pain. He wanted to believe her, wanted to reach out, to pull her close and tell her that they could work through this. But he couldn't force himself to ignore the anger and betrayal that still burned within him. "You say you want to rebuild trust," he said slowly. "But trust isn't something you can just patch up with promises, Camilla. It's built piece by piece, and you've shattered it." She nodded, wiping her tears, her voice shaking. "I understand, Max. I know I have a long way to go, if you even want to try." Max took a deep breath, letting her words linger in the air between them. He felt exhausted, unsure of what he wanted or what could come next. But for tonight, he knew he couldn't be near her. The pain was still too fresh, the betrayal too raw. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving her standing there alone, holding on to a sliver of hope he couldn't bring himself to share. As the first light of dawn crept into the bedroom, Max lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't slept at all. The room felt cold and unfamiliar, weighed down by an emptiness that seemed to seep from the walls. Camilla had retreated to the guest room sometime in the early hours, her footsteps barely audible as she passed by the closed bedroom door. In the past, her presence had always been a comfort, a warmth beside him. Now it was a reminder of all that had been shattered between them. He sat up slowly, rubbing his hands over his face, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. The clarity he'd hoped to find overnight hadn't come. Instead, he felt hollow, as though a part of him had been carved out and left behind in the kitchen, where she had begged for his forgiveness. He wished he could make sense of the wreckage, find a way to untangle the love he still felt from the betrayal that had ripped through it. He pulled on a shirt and wandered into the kitchen, where the remnants of last night's confrontation lingered in the stale air. Camilla had cleaned up the wine glass. The folder of receipts was gone, but he could still feel the weight of the words they had exchanged hanging in the room. He poured himself a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the steam rising from the mug as he tried to steady himself, to find some kind of resolve. A soft rustle at the doorway caught his attention, and he looked up to find Camilla standing there, her face pale and drawn. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes, her expression raw and uncertain. It was clear she'd slept no better than he had. "Max," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, hesitant. "Can we talk? I just need to know where we stand. If we're even going to try." He let out a long breath, turning away from her. "I don't know, Camilla. I honestly don't know." His voice was low, each word deliberate, as though saying them out loud would help him grasp his own feelings. "How do you think we can move forward when I don't even recognize you anymore? When every time I look at you, I feel betrayed?" She stepped closer, wringing her hands nervously. "I know I've destroyed your trust, Max, and I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I don't even expect you to want to try." She paused, swallowing hard before she continued. "But I do love you. I can't just walk away from this without at least trying to fix what I've broken." Max studied her, searching her face for any trace of the woman he had once known so well. Her desperation was clear, her remorse genuine, but something about her felt different now, distant and unfamiliar. "Love isn't enough, Camilla," he said quietly. "Love didn't stop you from doing what you did. Love didn't keep you from lying to me for months." Her lips quivered as she held back tears. "You're right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I let everything slip through my fingers because I was selfish, because I was too afraid to admit how lost I felt. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I'm not willing to fight to earn your trust back." He shook his head, exasperated, the weariness settling over him like a blanket. "How, Camilla?" he asked, voice edged with frustration. "How do you expect me to ever look at you the same way? To forget the lies, the nights I spent wondering where you were?" She looked away, biting her lip as she fought to hold back her emotions. "I don't have the answers, Max. I just know that I can't imagine my life without you. I'm willing to do anything, whatever it takes, to try and make things right." Max let her words sink in, feeling the weight of them press against his already heavy heart. He wanted to believe her, to trust that she was sincere, but the wounds were too fresh, too raw. The life they had built, the foundation they had trusted, was now cracked, and he didn't know if it could ever be repaired. "I need time," he said finally, his voice steady but weary. "I can't make any promises right now. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you or if we can rebuild what's been broken. But for now, I need space to figure out what I want." She nodded slowly, her expression filled with sorrow and regret. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. "I'll be here waiting if you're ever ready." He looked at her one last time, his gaze heavy with the memories they shared and the pain that now clouded them. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the quiet of the kitchen, alone with her remorse and the shattered remains of their life together. Days passed, each one blending into the next, as Max tried to regain a sense of normalcy. He threw himself into work, staying later than usual, hoping that the endless tasks and late hours would dull the ache inside him. But even in the hum of the office, his thoughts drifted back to Camilla, to the hollow silence of the house he now dreaded returning to. Every time he crossed the threshold, he felt the ghost of their argument lingering, a painful reminder that nothing would ever be the same. Camilla, meanwhile, seemed to drift through their shared spaces like a shadow, moving quietly, almost invisibly, as if afraid to intrude on his thoughts. She made a point of leaving him alone, respecting the distance he had asked for, but he could feel her presence everywhere, her quiet movements in the morning, the clink of dishes she washed in the kitchen, her careful avoidance of his eyes whenever they crossed paths. The walls that had once felt warm now felt claustrophobic, a place where his grief and anger seemed to echo endlessly. One evening, as Max was gathering his things to leave the office, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He hesitated, his pulse quickening as he opened the message. "Max, it's Ethan. Camilla mentioned you needed some space, but I wanted to reach out. I'm here if you need to talk, man." Ethan was an old friend, someone who had known both him and Camilla since college. They had spent countless evenings together, double dates and holidays, sharing stories, advice, laughs. Max had kept their troubles to himself, unsure how to even begin explaining what had happened. But in that moment, he realized he needed an outlet, someone who could understand his pain without judgment. He replied quickly, agreeing to meet for a drink. And half an hour later, he found himself seated across from Ethan in a quiet corner of a bar. The place was dimly lit, offering a comforting anonymity that Max found oddly soothing. Ethan looked at him with quiet concern, a look that seemed to say he already knew, without needing to ask. "Man, I'm sorry," Ethan began after a long silence, his voice low and steady. "Camilla told me a bit, but I didn't realize it was this bad." Max nodded, his throat tight as he tried to find the words. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice strained. "It feels like everything I thought I knew just fell apart overnight. I keep asking myself what I missed, what I could have done to see it coming. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. Don't do that to yourself, Max. You loved her. You trusted her. Those aren't things you should be punishing yourself for. Max's gaze fell to the table, the weight of his friend's words sinking in. It's not just the betrayal, he said after a moment. It's that she didn't trust me enough to be honest. She kept so much from me, and now I feel like I was the last to know, like a fool. Ethan's face hardened slightly. You're not a fool. What she did is on her, not you. But Max, what do you want now? Do you think you could ever forgive her? Max took a deep breath, his fingers tracing patterns on the edge of his glass. I don't know, he said honestly. Every time I think about forgiving her, I remember all the lies, all the times I looked at her and saw someone I didn't even know. It's like she's a stranger now, and I don't know if I could ever trust her again. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to decide now. Take your time. Figure out what feels right for you. But whatever you do, don't let this change the man you are. I don't let it make you afraid to trust, to love again. Max looked at him, grateful for the words that felt like a lifeline in the dark. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of clarity, a faint sense of direction amidst the turmoil. After finishing their drinks, they parted ways with a silent understanding. Max returned home that night feeling lighter, though still burdened. He wasn't sure if he was ready to forgive Camilla, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let this break him. The next morning, as Max woke to the soft light filtering through the curtains, he felt a strange calm settle over him, a stillness he hadn't felt in days. For the first time since discovering Camilla's betrayal, he felt a sense of purpose, not clarity exactly, but an inner resolve. He knew he couldn't stay in this limbo forever, lost between the past and an uncertain future. Whatever he decided, he would have to confront Camilla one last time, to close the door on this chapter, whether or not it led to reconciliation. He made his way downstairs to find her already awake, sitting in the living room, clutching a mug of coffee, her face pale and contemplative. She looked up as he entered, surprise and a flicker of hope crossing her expression. He could see that she was bracing herself, ready for whatever he might say, perhaps afraid of what he'd finally decided. Camilla, he said, his voice steady but soft, we need to talk. For real this time. She nodded, setting down her mug, and gestured for him to sit. There was a long silence as he took a seat across from her, each of them searching for the right words, knowing that this conversation would define their future, whatever shape it took. I've had a lot of time to think, Max began, choosing his words carefully. And I keep coming back to the same question. Why? Why didn't you just tell me? Even when things started to feel different between us, why didn't you just say something? Camilla looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. I was afraid. Afraid of hurting you, of ruining everything. I thought I could manage it, that I could somehow keep that part separate. But it was a mistake, one I've regretted every day since. She glanced up, her eyes filled with remorse. Max, I know it sounds hollow now, but I didn't want to lose you. Max nodded slowly, absorbing her words, feeling both the truth and the lingering sting of betrayal in them. Maybe you didn't want to lose me, but you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth, he said, his voice calm but firm. I would have listened, Camilla. I would have tried to understand. But you took that choice away from me. Her face fell, and he saw the tears well up in her eyes. She was silent, as though finally understanding the depth of what she had broken. I know, Max, she whispered, her voice shaking. And if I could take it back, I would. I'd do anything to fix this, to earn your trust again. Max closed his eyes for a moment, grappling with the weight of her words. He didn't doubt her sincerity, but sincerity alone couldn't rebuild what had been shattered. He'd spent so many years building a life with her, believing in their love, and now he faced the hardest truth of all. Some things, once broken, couldn't be mended. Camilla, he began, his voice gentle but resolute, I don't know if we can go back to what we had. I don't even know if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way. Trust, it's not something you can just rebuild overnight. She wiped at her tears, nodding. I understand, Max. I don't expect you to just forgive me and forget. I know this is my fault, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes, no matter how long it takes, if you'll give me a chance. He looked at her, his heart heavy, torn between the love he once felt and the pain that remained. Part of him wanted to reach out to try and salvage what they had. But the deeper part of him, the one that had faced the worst of the betrayal, knew that he couldn't just will away the damage. He would always wonder, always question. Finally, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle within him. Camilla, I think I need to let go. I can't keep holding on to something that's hurting both of us. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive you fully, but right now, I think it's best if we go our separate ways." Her face crumpled, but she nodded, understanding what he couldn't put into words. She took a shuddering breath, gathering the strength to accept his decision, even though it broke her. "I'll respect whatever you choose, Max. I'll always care for you, and I'm sorry for everything." They sat in silence, the reality of their parting settling around them. For a brief moment, he felt the echo of their love, the memories of what they had shared, but it was quickly swept away by the ache of loss. As he stood to leave, he looked back at her, knowing that this would be the last time he'd see her in this home they'd once built together. Without another word, he walked toward the door, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and relief. When he stepped outside, he felt the cool morning air on his face, a reminder that life would go on. He had taken the first step into a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty but also, perhaps, a sliver of hope.